Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and talk about the M2 MacBook Air that just came out and compare it against the 14-inch MacBook Pro that also just came out recently as well. Now, there is a lot of differences between these two things, and I'm going to talk about them heavily. The M1 Pro MacBook Pro, the 14-inch model, is the one I use now on an everyday basis, but the M2 MacBook Air is the one that just came out. If you want to pick up either one of these MacBooks though, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, what is very, very interesting is that the design of both these MacBooks are very, very similar. I've never really seen a design where both these MacBooks, even like the cheapest MacBook Air that you can buy, or one of the cheapest ones, and that one of the more expensive MacBooks you can pick up, are actually around the same type of design, which is very interesting. So on the outside, they both have the Apple logos on top, and they both have somewhat of the same type of like flat top architecture. The M2 MacBook Air does have a little bit of a thinner body though. So keep that in mind. If you wanted to have like the thinnest and most portable type of MacBook, then definitely the M2 MacBook Air is probably the better one for you. I think it's definitely a much more thinner MacBook that you can carry around, but the 14-inch MacBook Pro has been a really good upgrade for me personally from my M1 MacBook Pro, and I think it's been a really decent MacBook overall. I don't think it was as big of a jump from my 2015 to my M1 model, but I like that 14-inch design, and because the M1 Pro MacBook is a little bit bigger, I actually do like this a little bit more than the M2 MacBook Air design. But I do like how portable the M2 MacBook Air is. I like how thin it is. And honestly, I feel like when I put the M2 MacBook Air in my book bag, it may like crack in half or something because of its thinness. Obviously, it's not. It's a very durable machine. So that is one thing to keep in mind as well. Now, the port selection on these MacBooks are a little bit different too. And this is where things are very, very interesting. So on the M2 MacBook Air, we have a few more ports than its original design. We had two USB 3 ports. We have two Thunderbolt 4 ports, which is really cool. So you can go ahead and connect two Thunderbolt 4 ports within it, and you have a really solid option right there. But we also have a MagSafe charger on this specific MacBook as well. Now, I think that's awesome. Having that MagSafe charger there is really cool. You can plug in your MacBook via there, and you can still free up some ports on your left side as well. So that's always cool too. Now, on the other side, on the M1 Pro MacBook, the 14-inch model, we have three Thunderbolt 4 ports. So we're getting an additional Thunderbolt 4 port. And the one thing I like about these is that you can actually go ahead and have, one Thunderbolt 4 port on both sides. So you have two on one side and one on the other. So if you want to charge on one side, if you want to use an accessory on the other, you have that capability. So it is a little bit nicer to have it on both sides. You also have an HDMI port as well. So you can go and connect a monitor to that HDMI port. But my favorite thing is that you have an SD card slot on the 14-inch MacBook Pro. That in and of itself is easily one of the best things about having a Pro MacBook. Now, if you don't plan on using an SD card slot at all, I never use my HDMI port, so it doesn't really matter. But if you don't plan on using the HDMI port either, then the M2 MacBook Air is probably a no-brainer in my opinion. You get to save a bunch of money, you get a technically newer chipset, but you're also, not using a super thick MacBook that you don't really need to utilize. So if that's the case, then go for the M2 MacBook Air. But personally, I love having those types of ports, and having that SD card slot is easily one of my favorite things about these MacBooks as well. So that is definitely one thing to keep in mind, at least in my standpoint. Now, I will say another big thing with the M2 MacBook Air, you can't use multiple displays. You can only use one display on that specific MacBook. There are other ways to go about doing, using multiple different, different monitors. But with my M1 MacBook Pro, I had a really hard time actually utilizing and kind of getting over the hump of using one display when I love using multiple displays. Now, luckily for me, I had a 5K iMac that I could use universal control on, so it is like almost having like two monitors. But if you don't even want to buy another iMac, then it may make sense to buy another MacBook Pro like this one, the M1 Pro MacBook, and possibly use that specific MacBook over the M2 MacBook Air. So that is one little caveat. I've personally been affected by it, and maybe you'll be affected by it too. Now, opening up these MacBooks, we have their beautiful displays. Now, both these displays are pretty good. With the M2 MacBook Air, they both have notches too. The M2 MacBook Air has a 13.6-inch Liquid Retina display, where the M1 Pro MacBook, the 14-inch model, has a 14.2-inch Liquid Retina XDR display. Now, at their core, they're both really good panels. I think the Air lineup now is at a really good spot for their display technology, but the MacBook Pro does have that Pro Motion display. And I will definitely tell you, it is a really big difference. Going from a, standard 60 Hz up to, 120 Hz is really, really nice, but it's not as crazy of a difference as it used to be on the iPads. I think the iPad, going from 60 Hz to 120 Hz is the biggest upgrade in my opinion. With even my iPhones, I kind of get used to 120 Hz, and now with my MacBook, I'm kind of used to 120 Hz as well. And honestly, at this point, I kind of do feel like I use my MacBook more so docked up to a monitor, so I'm not even using the actual display on my MacBook anymore that much. If you're in the same similar kind of stance where you're kind of docking it up more than you're actually using it portably and looking at the actual display, it may make a little bit more sense to buy an M2 MacBook Air and save some money. But if not, the M1 Pro MacBook is probably the better one, one for people who are going to be looking at the display a lot. And because the M2 MacBook Air costs $1199 and the MacBook Pro costs $1999, there's quite a bit of a difference in terms of the price tag between these as well. So keep that in mind. Now we get into the actual performance between them. So with the M2 MacBook Air, you get an 8-core CPU, and you can get up to a 10-core GPU, but the base model does come with 8 cores of CPU and 8-core GPU, so definitely keep that in mind. With the M1 MacBook Pro, the Pro models, the 14 and 16-inch ones, you get to have either that M1 Pro chipset or that M1 Max chipset. So you can get up to 10 cores of CPU, you can get up to 32 cores of your GPU, which is crazy. I think for a lot of people out there, you may not even need to have all that power. Personally, I think an M1 MacBook Air is still more than enough powerful for my use case, but between these two, these are both very popular and very powerful machines that you probably won't be finding too many complaints about, at least in my opinion from what I've seen. You can also get up to 64 gigabytes of RAM on the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and you can get up to 8 terabytes of storage on that MacBook Pro as well, whereas on the M2 MacBook Air, you can get 24 gigabytes of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage, which personally for me, like I mentioned, is more than enough. I think that's a great amount of RAM, that's a great amount of storage to have on a device like this, so I'm not really going to have too many complaints about it in that standpoint. But I will say from that type of MacBook and that type of layout, that is a really strong performing MacBook on both these, but it's quite clear the MacBook Pro, the 14-inch model, is going to be the better option here for you. If you're somebody who's going to be utilizing a lot of power and utilizing everything from within a MacBook, this is probably the one that I would recommend most people to buy just from that standpoint. It doesn't mean you have to go and buy this one, but it is probably the MacBook that is going to be the best one if you're coming from a pure power to power standpoint. But I think the M2 MacBook Air for a majority of people watching this is still more than enough powerful, and I would probably recommend buying that. I mean, it's not like a bad MacBook by any means either. Now, in terms of the actual battery life, this is where things are really interesting. The 14-inch MacBook Pro has a 17-hour battery life, from Apple, and that's what they stated, and I don't find my MacBook getting 17 hours. I feel like I have to charge it all the time. But with the M2 MacBook Air, Apple is stating it's 18 hours of battery life. So you are actually getting an extra hour of battery life on the M2 MacBook Air, but it doesn't really probably seem like it. Personally for me, I feel like something like the M2 MacBook Air, it's still more than enough powerful and it still has a lot of battery life within it. And the M1 Pro MacBook is still good, power as well. But again, you have to keep in mind that specific battery life has to be really, really focused in with its main performance. That is a performance heavy MacBook first, and battery life is kind of like second. With the M2 MacBook Air and the MacBook Air lineup has always been around battery life. And it's weird that these two are kind of, a little bit more of the same than ever before. Historically, it's been like MacBook Airs have the best battery life, and then maybe like some other MacBooks have, a little bit worse. In this case, they're kind of getting neck and neck now. So I'll be curious to see what happens in the future, but this does kind of take me to the end of the video. And to be honest, like I mentioned before, I think a MacBook like the M1 Pro MacBook is still the better one, even though it has technically an older chipset inside. It makes a lot more sense to buy that MacBook over something like the M2 MacBook Air if you have the money, but if not, I still think the M2 MacBook Air is a very good value. It has a lot of capability built in as well, and you can't really go wrong with that MacBook either. Like, I still think that's a very solid option. It really just depends on your use case and really how much are you willing to spend. Are you okay with spending a little bit more money? Then go for the M1 MacBook Pro, the 14-inch model. But if not, I think the M2 MacBook Air is kind of a no-brainer. I'd probably recommend buying that for a majority of people watching this. But if you do need a little bit extra power, then maybe going up to the 14-inch one is probably the best one for you. So that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.